Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you to Cobleskill, New York, a village about 45 miles west of Albany, the state capital. During the late 1870s and early 1880s, about 15, 20 years after the war, you could see the local butcher driving his meat wagon through the streets of town. It was a fairly common sight. On some days, residents glimpsed the butcher clinging to the side of his wagon, holding to the side of it and struggling to catch his breath, definitely winded and having trouble breathing. He was a young man and he was an immigrant from Ireland. He had come to America as a boy with his parents. He was also a veteran of the Civil War. And he's pictured here. His name is James Brownlee. To understand why he struggled to catch his breath, we have to go to the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, the first of the three-day fight. On that day, Union forces along the northern edge of Gettysburg occupied a precarious position. As advancing Confederates pouring deadly volleys into the rapidly thinning blue ranks as a steady stream of wounded trickled into the normally peaceful Pennsylvania town. A federal division commander in the thick of the fray, General Carl Schurz, was running out of options. As a former German revolutionary who became an influential voice among his fellow political refugees, he sent his aides scrambling in search of reinforcements. While Schurz waited for help, he received reports that Union troops on his right and left had buckled under the intense pressure of the oncoming Confederate juggernaut. Just a mile south, Brownlee, now a corporal in the 134th New York Infantry, watched and listened to the raging battle from the heights of Cemetery Hill. He and his comrades could clearly see the fighting where Schurz was hotly engaged. The New Yorkers wondered with growing anxiety what fate had in store for them. They had just completed a march of about 13 miles, the last 5 made with the ominous roar of artillery and musket fire ringing in their ears. Upon their arrival, they received orders to support cannon stationed on Cemetery Hill, and they promptly filed into position. Nearby, the ranking Union general on the field at that moment was Oliver O. Howard, the one-armed general. He had suffered an amputation a year earlier on the peninsula. He had received Schurz's request for reinforcements. Howard at first declined to send in his reserves. He was determined to hold on to every man he had to defend the high ground along Cemetery Hill. But he finally relented and ordered a brigade to assist the beleaguered Schurz. The brigade chosen for the assignment was composed of 4 undersized regiments of Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers, including Brownlee and the 134th. The colonel of Brownlee's regiment, Charles R. Coster, also commanded the brigade. The 23-year-old Coster had resigned as a line officer in the regular army to accept the colonelcy of the 134th when it was organized just the previous autumn. About 4 p.m. on the 1st, Coster formed his brigade with the 131st in the front and led it down the gentle slope of Cemetery Hill. Then the Federals marched in double-quick time into the streets of Gettysburg, where the little column moved against a rising tide of wounded and retreating soldiers. Coster pulled up near the railroad depot, where he detached one of his regiments, the 73rd Pennsylvania, and posted it in reserve. He continued forward with the 134th and 2 other regiments. Meanwhile, out in front, Schurz's troubles had only intensified. The Union right had broken, and troops there were steadily losing ground. His position was about to be overrun by the rebels. Schurz needed time, only a few precious minutes, to withdraw his men to the relative safety of Cemetery Hill. At this critical moment, he met Coster in the streets of Gettysburg. I led it out of town and ordered it to deploy on the right of the junction of the roads near the railroad depot, which the enemy was fast approaching, explained Schurz in his after-action report. Custer's brigade, alone in the streets of Gettysburg, with Union soldiers coming at them, was about to be sacrificed to get those precious minutes, about to be sacrificed for the greater good. The little brigade turned off the road at John Coon's brickyard, where 3 regiments hastily formed battle lines. The 27th Pennsylvania positioned itself on the left, and the 154th New York was in the center. Means the 134th was on the right. They lined up in front of the brickyard kilns and behind a post and rail fence. The 134th on the right of the brigade line was now the extreme right of the entire Union Army. It was positioned beyond the brickyard with only a portion of the fence for protection. Confederate brigades suddenly appeared on the horizon, moving fast across the fields toward them. These rebels were battle-hardened veterans from North Carolina and Louisiana, part of a division commanded by the irascible General Jubal Early. There were about 2,500 of them, about 3 times as large as Custer's brigade. The North Carolinians were in the advance, and they closed rapidly on Custer's men. Corporal Brownlee and his comrades braced for action. When the rebels were about 60 yards away, the New Yorkers managed a well-aimed volley. The enemy kept on coming and delivered a murderous fire that ripped into the ranks of the 134th. The Confederates overwhelmed the Union line in front and slipped around the exposed right flank and moved into the rear of the regiment. One of the Confederate colonels, Archibald C. Godwin of the 57th North Carolina Infantry, praised the Federals for their resistance in his official battle report. He observed, quote, "the enemy stubbornly holding their position until we had climbed over into their midst," end quote. Godwin's North Carolinians caught the New Yorkers in crossfire from 3 sides and slaughtered them where they stood. The regiment literally disintegrated. Brownlee was positioned on the far right, where the Confederates swarmed, and their fire was at its hottest. Bullets and buckshot tore into Brownlee's body from all sides. Still standing, a chunk of railroad iron about 18 inches long, fired from a cannon, struck his knapsack and finally knocked him to the ground. Brownlee, in shock, gathered his strength and his consciousness, tore at his clothes, and took stock of his injuries. He found that shots had struck both of his thighs, but no bones had been fractured. A 3rd bullet penetrated just below the surface of the skin in his right hip. He reached down and removed it immediately. A 4th bullet passed laterally through his breastbone, ripped into his chest cavity, and perforated his right lung. Nowadays, this type of wound is called a sucking chest wound. The bullet passed out of his chest below his right nipple. Finally, 3 buckshot fired from the barrel of a shotgun pierced his left side and passed completely through his body. One of those balls pierced his bladder. He lay gasping for air on the ground, with dead, dying, and wounded men strewn in every conceivable position. He was now in enemy territory, as the Confederates had driven away or captured the rest of the regiment, and they rolled into Gettysburg. Regimental historian of the 134th, George W. Conklin, estimated that 400 members of the regiment entered the engagement. Only 32 men and officers mustered for duty that evening. Overnight, the ranks swelled to about 100, as about 20 men feared dead or missing made their way back, and another 50 who had been detached from the regiment and missed the action were returned to their regular duties. During the months that followed, the regiment added recruits and would go on to participate in Major General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864 and the Carolinas Campaign in 1865. Colonel Coster survived to fight another day, but the other regiments in his brigade suffered a fate similar to that of the 134th. Among the killed was a sergeant in the 154th New York Infantry, Amos Humiston. His unidentified corpse was found clutching a photograph of his 3 children, and it was widely circulated across the North. You students of the Civil War are very familiar with that story.
The story of Amos Humiston is told in another documentary called The Civil War, or no, it's called Gettysburg, and I will put that in this video.
The children were eventually identified, recognized, and Humiston's identity established. The photograph became one of the most enduring images of the war. The sacrifice of Coster's brigade bought shirts about 20 minutes' time, according to reports. The general, Carl Schurz, credited the brigade, Coster's brigade, in his after-action report for checking the enemy advance long enough, just long enough, to allow his troops to complete the retreat through the streets of Gettysburg and the safety of Cemetery Hill to support General Howard and his men. Brownlee became a prisoner of war and was placed in the care of a Confederate surgeon. The doctor removed fragments of breastbone from his chest wound and stuffed the gaping hole with wads of lint. He made Brownlee as comfortable as possible for what was likely to be a slow and agonizing death. Meanwhile, the regiment officially reported Brownlee killed. The note was, quote, died at Gettysburg from wounds received in action, end quote. That's what appeared on his muster record. 2 days later, Pickett's charge reversed Confederate fortunes and prompted General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia to beat a hasty retreat back to Virginia. Lee left behind a large number of his wounded and prisoners of war in care of surgeons and chaplains. Union troops moved in to assist, and within the wreckage and the rubble, the bodies strewn across the battlefield, they found Brownlee. He was still alive. They carried him to a makeshift hospital where Union surgeons removed a bullet embedded in his right thigh and cleaned up his other injuries. The damaged lung was closely monitored. Quote, whenever the dressing was removed, he breathed with great difficulty, but on being replaced, he felt immediate relief, end quote. That's according to an official medical report. One surgeon declared, strange to say, he recovered from his wounds. That chest wound, that sucking chest wound, slowly healed. The perforated bladder leaked urine for 10 days, leading to surgeons to conjecture that the sterile fluid might have prevented infection and actually saved his life. Brownlee spent the next 2 years convalescing in military hospitals, 2 years. In June of 1865, he transferred to a facility in Albany, New York, not all that far from Cobleskill. About this time, the image here, it's when he posed in a local photography studio to hide the effects of that chest wound, which rendered his collapsed right lung useless and caused his shoulder to slump considerably. He outfitted himself with a thick padding beneath his clothes. That padding also hid a fistulous opening from which air escaped whenever he breathed. His physician recommended country living and suggested handling cattle and meat as a health-improving occupation. This is doctoring in the 19th century. Brownlee heeded the doctor's advice, and that's how he got to become a butcher in Cobleskill, and where local folks would see him struggling against the meat wagon on some of those days in the 1870s and the early 1880s.
On the northern edge of Gettysburg, Union troops are taking a beating. All that stands between the town and the rebel assault is the 11th Corps. Among them, Sergeant Amos Humiston, ex-whaler, father of 3. He enlisted after hearing President Abraham Lincoln's plea for 300,000 recruits.
Amos Humiston was like so many Union soldiers who felt this deep love for family and for home, but he also had a deep sense of commitment for the Army and for his nation.
A bullet glanced off his ribs 6 weeks ago at Chancellorsville.
All I ask is I can die in battle like a man. But I hate the idea of dying here like a hog.
Battering the 11th Corps from a hill above town is Lee's newly appointed Lieutenant General Dick Ewell. Tenacious, eccentric, profane. Ewell lost his left leg fighting the Iron Brigade last summer at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Now he's out for revenge. A month ago, Robert E. Lee's legendary second-in-command, Stonewall Jackson, was killed in battle. Ewell replaced him. It's a lot to live up to. But today, Ewell has the Union on the run. After suffering 9,000 casualties, Union soldiers retreat from Gettysburg. Humiston has orders to cover the retreat. But they're under heavy fire. By 4 p.m., his units outflanked and fall back into town. But they've got nowhere to go. It's a rout for the rebels. Amos Humiston is surrounded. He's in for the fight of his life. The Army of Northern Virginia is on a roll, mowing down Union troops with deadly precision. After just 10 hours of fighting, the Union's retreating. 9,000 already killed or wounded. The rebels are close to the victory Lee seeks.
Every battle that Lee fights, every victory that he wins, where he does not achieve the destruction of the Army of the Potomac, he just expended capital with no strategic effect. Lee knows the clock's ticking. He wants to stay on them so that he can destroy them.
Sergeant Amos Humiston puts his life on the line, covering the Union retreat. Confederate troops have overrun the town. Of the 270 men in Humiston's regiment, all but 18 are killed, captured, or wounded. Humiston is trapped.
You have put the little ones to bed, dear wife, and covered them o'er with care. My Frankie, Allie, and Fred, and they have said their evening prayer. Perhaps they breathed the name of one who is far in southern land, and wished he too were there to join their little band. Oh, when will this rebellion cease? This cursed war be over? And we, our dear ones, meet, to part from them no more.
Amos Humiston is wounded and alone in a yard in the middle of town. He grasps an ambrotype, a photographic image of his 3 children fixed in glass, a present from his wife on his way to war. Rebel troops in town don't notice Amos Humiston. Mortally wounded, he prepares to die alone, except for the photograph of his children.
How I want to see them and their mother is more than I can tell. I hope that we may all see each other again. The first time that I see you, I will tell you more than I can think of now. Be a good girl. So, goodbye.
Amos Humiston bleeds to death. No identification. A young girl finds a fallen soldier in a yard. He has no identification, but grasps a photograph of 3 children fixed in glass. The picture becomes famous, widely printed in newspapers. The mystery of the unknown soldier captures the country's imagination. 4 months later, a woman in upstate New York recognizes the children and solves the mystery. The soldier is Amos Humiston. She is his widow. Humiston is buried at a new cemetery on the Gettysburg battlefield.
The story of Amos Humiston and Brownlee as well were both very interesting stories from the Battle of Gettysburg. Both of them were in Charles R. Custer's brigade. Brownlee was in the 134th New York. Humiston was in the 154th New York. And both very interesting stories. I thought that would definitely, they would make a great Civil War story.